And still on vocabulary and language, we are also finding that, and these are observations, that when we engage with our students, and we were using primarily English, but what happens is that when we engage them, we allow them to speak in their home languages. And the reason why we use English, I think, is really to avoid what has been discussed here about, how do you deal with turning point in Sizulu. So we find that at this stage, it's a lot easier to use English, but of course it means that there has to be room that we should start expanding on African languages in how we use them here. But just from a discourse point of view, words like right, volume, expression, they have a lot of meanings. Now imagine a student who's just doing second language trying to learn maths and already is coming there, they understand right to mean one thing and volume another. The right, volume, and expression, they understand those terms to mean something totally different to what we could be intending for them to understand. And also, the confusion, and these are the observations that we're having on sounds that, they could confuse them. You may think that it's a joke, but really, when we deal with high school learners, we are uncovering that some of these things are issues. And also some other things that we're finding is that there are those students who get very excited about these new terms, and they almost use them as bombastic words to brag to other people. And what is said is that they don't apply them correctly, but at least there's the excitement to talk about interpolating, and I don't know if it's a way of engaging a person of an opposite sex to try and, gain some points with that. But whatever the case might be, is that there's the wrong use of these words. So there's an overexcitement about some of these terminologies as we introduce them. So, we're realizing that we are having to now offset that a little bit. Something that I feel very strongly about, and this really goes all the way from basic education to even undergrad, it's the notation that I used. I've read, I don't know how many articles where you read something and the notation just throws you off. And these are some of the things. I think earlier on there was an appeal that can't we find a mechanism where we just standardize some of these things. I think it will be a lot of work. There will be a lot of politics because some other people, when they write, they have preferences. If you don't believe me, you have to look back to Newton fighting with his colleague about what notation to use in maths. So the idea, though, is that currently I think it would be important to ensure that whatever materials that we use for education, that we find a way to communicate notation in a way that it doesn't throw off students, because this is also a critical element that I find that people struggle with. Okay, what I do at the university, I am in a group that focuses on particularly helping students who didn't perform as well as they needed to. And when they come, they want to do engineering, so we have a 4-year program, and then we have what is called the 5-year program. So part of some of the subjects that I teach, they are in the 5-year program. And already from the studies, part of what I also do is to do research in engineering education. So some of the things that we observe is that there's a lot of gaps that students have. So over time, we decided to focus on 3 things. That being the background knowledge, conceptual understanding, and problem-solving skills. Now, under background knowledge, that's where language issues come across, because as I had mentioned, I already saw that with a lot of students, there's a certain terms that we may take for granted, but they really throw them off. Just this past semester, we wrote a test, and there was a problem that was given, and part of that problem, a colleague of mine used the word component to refer to vectors. And that had a dual meaning, and most of the students understood the opposite of what my colleague had intended. And it ended up with, well, just as an example of one question, they used a lot of these kind of words a lot in the test, and eventually, the performance was really terrible. So we're trying to understand, why did they perform so badly? And we realized that it's because we asked them a lot of word questions, a lot of theoretical questions. And I was then asking myself, the theoretical questions, was it really because the underlying concepts were hard, or was it because, especially for those who speak English as a second language, was it because some of the words are not well understood? And we're still in a debate about that, but I'm fairly convinced that language plays a role in that. Yes, the subject we're teaching, static mechanics, is a very difficult subject in itself, But it gets even worse when you have these word questions and you take for granted that there's dynamics on language that students experience. So to that extent, I'm fairly convinced that we need to be doing a lot of work, particularly on the discourse, how we talk as engineers, as scientists, in terms of conveying our ideas. Just to go back to the programs, the two programs that I had mentioned, 10 slides away. I'm 3 slides away from the end. So the two projects that we did, if you recall, I said we have a Saturday school program, and then we have this inquiry-based type of learning. On the inquiry-based type of learning, the Inkatuto project that I had mentioned, one of the things that I really found very interesting is that we allow students to do research whichever way they choose. When they present the results, usually some of the people who come to evaluate, they come from different African backgrounds. So you find that somebody speaks Sepedi and comes there and asks the student to elaborate on how they went about doing their research. And what is fascinating really is the fact that they are able to express themselves so much better and still keep to the underlying concepts when they do express themselves in their home languages. And if they have to switch, there are those, of course, who come from well-to-do schools and they are able to still manage. But the point here being that I find that the project-based inquiry type projects that we give, they allow students to, tangle with the concepts because, we're going to require them to apply and demonstrate their knowledge. So already they are forced to understand the concepts, to find ways to express them, whether it's in Sepedi, this is Zulu, but to find ways to express them where ultimately they solve the problem. Because at the end of the day, if the problem is solved, it doesn't matter whether you did Sepedi or Zulu, the problem is just not solved. You have to find a way to solve the problem. But I find that in this kind of environment where they are able to exchange ideas, when you allow them to engage by themselves and you listen to them, they'll be engaging with their own ways of understanding concepts in their own languages where they're comfortable. Of course, they borrow a lot of words. Just to use it again, the example of turning point. They would just say, "Yeah, well, what I hope a turning point," which means in Soto, as you reach turning point. So they just do a lot of mixing. But the idea being that in such a setting, we are realizing that firstly, the freedom with which they're able to engage in their languages allows them to think even much deeper on concepts that they consider. So I find really project-based or inquiry-based learning to be one of the critical things that really assist us in this regard. So just to try and conclude in my last 2 slides, here are some issues of consideration that I think we're finding that we need to be doing. These programs that we're implementing, they're fairly new. Part of our frustration has been that if you consider the amount of money that we're pumping into education, it's a lot of money, staggering. And I'm not sure if we're getting return for investment. So what it means is that really, at this stage, more than accepting the status quo, we must be questioning it even more. It's just unacceptable that we should be putting so much money and not really getting the return. And part of what needs to happen is that, as I said, this is a new program, so we're constantly, changing, adjusting it so that we can really have results. But part of what we're intending to do is that whenever we give the lessons that we give, is to make sure that from a discourse point of view, that we identify critical terms and phrases that we feel are very important to establish a threshold knowledge. And by that I mean that we have to identify what are the key things that we want students to learn. And out of that, together with that, identify key phrases, key words that we then ensure that are properly understood. And this is where the opportunity lies that, if we have to expand, and actually we should, where we incorporate African languages, that we do that. Because already, as I said, just in English alone, even if you're a first English speaker, it's already challenging to understand the discourse. So the added layer to that would be to ensure that people learn also in African languages. And what we are also finding is that students really need opportunity to speak more, read more, write more, and listen. They don't always like to write, but it's an essential skill that they need to be implemented. We're finding that the more you push them, eventually they realize the benefits afterwards, but you get a lot of resistance in the beginning. And as I mentioned about words, sometimes we find that there are certain words that are preventing students from solving tasks, not because they don't understand the underlying concepts, because the formulation of the instruction is such that it's ambiguous or whatever the case may apply. So the instruction there, we have to work a lot on that, because sometimes you put a very difficult question because it is ambiguous, and we blame the students when they fail. And often enough it happens, people throw their hands in the air and they say, well, blame it on the basic education, especially for us coming from universities. But I think we need to take up some responsibilities as well to say, what is the discourse? How do students understand the way as scientists and engineers, how we talk, and how do we convey that? Okay, I said 2 more slides, but okay, I think it'll be 2, right? So there are also, and these are maybe just side issues. I'm finding that while we're tackling language, there are also a lot of socio-economic issues that are at play that sometimes overshadow even language. Just to give you an example, some of the students that we deal with, they come there and you find that, it's a small lady, a lady who is leading a household, and they still have to go and study maths and do all of these things. So in addition to language, we shouldn't forget about the fact that there's socio-economic issues that are challenging most of our young people. So we have to always bear that in mind. The other thing that we're finding is that we really, really have to work hard to make science fun. And students need to be intrinsically motivated to follow sciences, to follow maths, these very subjects that they consider difficult. And if it means, sharing it in Zulu so that somebody can find it entertaining for that moment, but also instructional and educational, we need to be able to do that. And a very critical element there, language has to be part of the learning process. It's not an afterthought, because I think we tend to do that. You do your calculation, and after that you're like, oops, there's also language. But it has to be part of the planning. So as I finish, I just want to leave you with these 3 points. I was asked to have 3 take-home points. And the idea with the take-home points, I suspect, is that if you forget everything else, you should remember that I played Mr Madisha in the beginning. No, I'm kidding. You should remember the following 3 points. And the first one is that, and these are really points that I'm really trying to say, please remember this, and these are important points. That we explore language as a discourse. And even if we're going to go and do it in Zulu, in Afrikaans, well, Afrikaans already there, whatever language we're going to implement, there is a way that industry people talk. And you will somehow need to factor that in. Perhaps, I don't know, we could maybe throw in something like Fanagalo, because if you look at people, how they work in the mines, they have a certain way of understanding each other. And it's neither English nor Afrikaans nor Sepedi or Zulu, but it's a very strange but interesting language. So, but the idea is that, we have to have discourse as part of how we explore language. The planning has to be right at the beginning. And an important point here, something that I've just been playing around in my head, something we're hoping to implement, is to have science fiction novels. Now, I've joined this new group that I've just realized in Pretoria. It also exists in Joburg. It's a group of writers. They write science fiction. So what drew me to their meetings was the fact that there was a number of authors who are looking at African science fiction. And that interested me because for the better part, I remember that as a young kid, one of the things I used to do was to read science fiction novels. And here's the beauty about science fiction novel. They have a language. They are speculative. They are not an exact science. But in their being speculative, they carry through a lot of interesting ideas that people can familiarize themselves, some discourse that they can begin to identify with. And what is even particularly interesting for me is that there's a lot of African authors who are coming in there who are also, from a content point of view, are bringing the African experience into science fiction writing. And this is something that I think, as a parting shot, as we're talking policies, to say perhaps what needs to happen is that we know that in high school we do novels. Can't we have a science fiction novel as part of our literature? Can't we have, because we already have authors, we have people who are excited about writing, and we need to be giving them a platform that can allow the discourse that I mentioned to take place. So that's just an idea that I'm leaving out there. Just if, in case you're interested, which African authors are there. I have a book here. The lady's Neri Okorafo. She's Nigerian, but she has very interesting science fiction material. And there's also upcoming South African science fiction writers as well. All right, so just to move on from that, the other point that I've mentioned, that the inquiry-based learning I find to be very critical because it has a lot of stimulation, there's a lot of intrinsic motivation that students experience as they engage in these projects. And that in itself allows a lot of learning for language, for concepts, for all the things that we worry about. And I find really that it really works. On the third element, Professor Lee that I mentioned in the beginning, they have this so-called American National, it's actually general, not generation, American National General Science Standards. Now, we also have standards from the Department of Basic Education. And now the idea is to say, especially when we start talking about how we involve discourse as part of how we propose learning, or introducing strong elements of vocabulary and how people learn sciences and the like. Perhaps we need to look at these standards with a view of saying what is happening in the US, particularly on this view of making sure that there's discourse. And by the way, this whole discourse idea is really aimed at people who are not first language speakers of English. With the US being very diverse, Hispanic communities coming through, and many other communities coming through, the professor then looked at a model that would allow especially students who are not first language speakers to actually excel in their learning of sciences and engineering. And the idea is that perhaps we can do something like that for our own standards locally here in South Africa. I've read our standards. I haven't quite seen that they speak to the language within sciences and or within the STEM fields. So with that, I think I'll just leave you with my last slide. And I would have actually left you with my uncle just giving the lesson one more time. But I think I'll leave it at that and say thank you.